In a quiet suburban neighborhood, there stood a quaint, charming house on the edge of town. It looked just like any other house, but within its walls lived a family that seemed perfect in their simplicity. Sarah and John, a loving couple, along with their two kids, Emily and Jake, lived here. They were just an ordinary family, living an extraordinary life filled with love and contentment. Sarah, a stay-at-home mom, spent her days tending to the garden, while John worked from home, balancing family life with his career. Emily and Jake, full of energy, played in the yard with their dog, Max. Max wasn't just any dog. He was a rescue, and though he came into their lives with a few scars from his past, he soon became an integral part of their family. Max was more than just a pet. He was their protector. He followed John everywhere, and at night he always slept beside the kids, guarding them in his own silent way. He was more than loyal. He was a hero in his own right. Every day seemed the same, a peaceful routine that many would envy. Sarah watered the plants in the garden, the kids played in the yard, and John worked in his home office. Max was always by their side, a constant in their life. But on one fateful evening, everything would change. It started innocently enough. The family was getting ready for dinner, enjoying each other's company when Max began acting strangely. He paced around the house, barking furiously at the door. This wasn't like him. He never barked this much unless there was a reason. Sarah thought maybe a squirrel or a stray animal had wandered too close to the house, but Max's behavior escalated quickly. He didn't stop. Instead, he started running frantically from room to room, his eyes wide with panic. Sarah tried to calm him down, but nothing worked. Max wasn't himself. He began nudging Emily and Jake, pushing them away from certain areas of the house. It was as if he was trying to warn them. The family looked at each other, confused, but they dismissed it as nothing more than a momentary oddity. They didn't understand it then, but Max could sense something they couldn't. As the evening went on, the family continued with their dinner, trying to ignore Max's increasingly frantic behavior. But then it happened. Max raced to the door again, barking with such intensity that it made Sarah's heart race. "What's going on, Max?" she asked, her voice trembling. John, still not understanding the gravity of the situation, reassured her. "He's just being weird. It's fine." But then Max stopped in front of the door, his body stiff, his eyes locked onto something unseen. He growled low in his throat, a sound Sarah had never heard before. It was clear now. Something was terribly wrong. Max was trying to warn them. In a sudden burst of energy, Max bolted towards the back door, as if telling the family to follow. "What's happening?" Sarah whispered, looking at John with wide eyes. Before they could react, Max sprinted out into the yard, pushing them to follow. And that's when they saw it. The smoke, the flicker of red in the distance. The house, their house, was on fire. Panic set in. The family raced out of the house, Max still running ahead of them, as if guiding them to safety. They reached the street and looked back to see the flames rising higher, consuming everything in their path. But in the midst of all this chaos, Max wasn't with them anymore. He had stayed behind. Max had chosen to remain in the house, to face whatever threat it was that they hadn't even seen yet. The fire roared in the background as the family stood helpless, watching their hero, their protector, inside the burning house. In that moment, they realized something. They hadn't just lost a dog. They had lost a family member, a friend, a hero. And what they didn't know yet was that this was just the beginning of a story that would change their lives forever. As the fire raged on, Sarah, John, Emily, and Jake stood there, frozen. Max, their beloved dog, had gone back inside the burning house. The family could only watch helplessly as the flames consumed everything they once called home. The heat was unbearable, and yet none of them could tear their eyes away from the house. John's heart was pounding in his chest, his thoughts racing. Why didn't he come out? He could have escaped too. The words felt hollow, and there was nothing that could erase the haunting image of Max running back into the fire. Sarah's mind was too clouded to speak, but her eyes filled with tears as she held Jake and Emily close. Max had saved them. He had warned them, but now he was gone, and it felt like a piece of their family had been torn away. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. The fire trucks arrived, sirens blaring, but it was too late. The flames had already consumed most of the house. They tried to put it out, but the damage was done. The family was safe, but the house, their home, was now just a pile of smoldering debris. John looked at the firefighter as they tried to control the fire, his voice shaky. "Please, my dog. Max. He's still inside. Please, you have to save him." But the firefighter shook his head solemnly. "It's too late. The fire is too intense. We can't go in." Tears welled up in John's eyes as he collapsed to the ground. "No, he can't be gone. He was our hero. He saved us." His voice cracked, and Sarah rushed to his side, pulling him into her arms as they both cried, the weight of the loss crushing them. Meanwhile, Emily and Jake stood apart from the adults, still in shock, unable to fully comprehend the gravity of the situation. Emily, only 8 years old, clutched her stuffed bear tightly, her small body shaking. Jake, at 6, didn't fully understand what was happening, but the sadness in his parents' eyes was enough to know that something important had been lost. They stood there, the family now incomplete, as the firefighters worked tirelessly to put out the flames. The house that had once been full of life, laughter, and love now lay in ruins. The night air grew colder, and the family shivered not just from the chill, but from the sense of helplessness that surrounded them. As the fire slowly died down, the family was left standing in the street, watching the charred remains of their home. The firefighters were still picking through the wreckage, trying to make sure the fire didn't flare up again. But there was no hope left for the house, and there was no sign of Max. The family was taken to a nearby shelter for the night, and while they were provided with food and blankets, it felt like nothing could comfort them. The world outside seemed to move on, but for Sarah, John, Emily, and Jake, time had stopped. They could only think of Max, their loyal companion, the one who had been there through thick and thin, and who had given his life to save them. The days that followed were a blur. The insurance company was contacted, the fire department issued a report, and the police made sure that nothing foul had caused the fire. But none of that mattered. They had lost their home, and more than that, they had lost Max. Weeks passed, but the family's grief didn't seem to fade. It was as if a heavy cloud had descended over their lives. Sarah and John were both consumed with the pain of the loss. They had tried to move forward, to find a new place to live, but every corner of their new apartment seemed empty without Max. The silence was deafening, and the kids often asked when Max would be home. It was a question neither Sarah nor John had the strength to answer. One evening, as they sat in their small apartment, there was a knock at the door. It was unexpected, and Sarah hesitated before answering. When she opened the door, she found a man standing there, holding a small package. "Excuse me, are you the family that lost their home in the fire?" the man asked. His voice was gentle, but there was an edge of urgency in his tone. "Yes, we are," Sarah replied, confused. "How do you know?" The man handed her the package, which was wrapped in plain brown paper. "This came for you. It's from Max," he said before turning and walking away without another word. Sarah stood there for a moment, her heart racing. Max? How could this be from Max? He was gone. But the words didn't make sense. She brought the package inside and showed it to John, her hands trembling. Together, they slowly unwrapped it. Inside the package was a small leather collar. It looked worn, as if it had been through a lot, but there was something else. Attached to the collar was a small metal tag with a phone number engraved on it. The tag looked like something Max had worn, but this was impossible. How could this have come from him? John's voice was barely a whisper. This is Max's collar." His eyes widened in disbelief. "But how is this possible?" Just then, the phone in their living room rang. Sarah hesitated before picking it up. She didn't know what to expect. "Hello?" she asked. "Is this the family who lost their dog in the fire?" A voice on the other end asked. It sounded serious, almost official. Yes, it is," Sarah replied, her heart pounding in her chest. "This is Officer Martinez from the local police department. We found something that might interest you," the officer said. "You're going to want to sit down for this." And with that, the mystery began to unravel. The family had no idea that what they were about to learn would shock them to their core and change everything they thought they knew about Max and the fire. The officer continued, "We found a lead that could explain what happened. Max, he didn't just run back into the fire for no reason. He had a purpose. He wasn't just trying to protect you. Max was trying to save you from something much bigger." As Sarah and John listened in disbelief, the officer explained that they had found traces of something unusual at the scene of the fire. It wasn't just a house fire. The fire had been started deliberately, and Max had known that. He had known that there was more at stake than just a random fire. The truth about Max's bravery and the truth about the fire was about to come to light. But even as the pieces started to fit together, the family still had one question. How had Max known? The officer on the phone explained, "We found some strange evidence at the fire site. Max didn't just run back into the house by instinct. Someone had planted something there. Something that set the house on fire." His voice was steady, but Sarah could sense that he was troubled. "And the more we've looked into it, the more we believe that Max wasn't just a dog. He had been involved in something bigger, something dangerous." John could hardly process the words. He looked at Sarah, but the shock in her eyes mirrored his own. They had always known that Max was special, but to think that there was something deeper at play, something connected to the fire that had destroyed everything they held dear, it felt like a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. "What do you mean, something bigger?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky. The officer paused before replying, "We're still investigating, but Max may have been trained, used for something far beyond just being a family dog. He was involved in something covert. And that collar? It's more than just a piece of his past. It's a key to understanding what he was part of." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Sarah's hands trembled as she held the phone to her ear. "What are you saying? Max was involved in something illegal?" she asked, a lump forming in her throat. "We believe so," Officer Martinez replied. "We found connections to a criminal organization, a syndicate. They use trained animals well, for things I can't fully explain over the phone. But we've got leads, and we're working on it." The room felt suffocating. Sarah dropped into a chair, her mind spinning. Max had been so much more than just a family pet. He had been part of a larger world, a world she never could have imagined. And now that world had cost him his life. John stood up, pacing nervously. "What does this mean for us?" he asked. "Is our family safe?" "Right now," the officer said, "our priority is to figure out what Max's role was in all of this. We believe he was working undercover, trying to stop something. We're going to need your help too. If you find anything else related to this collar or any strange behavior Max showed, it could help us piece this together." The officer's words left a chill in the air, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they had only scratched the surface. Max, their loyal dog who had saved their lives from the fire, had been entangled in something much darker. A hero in his own right, but not in the way they had ever imagined. As the call ended, Sarah put the phone down and looked at John, who was still pacing, his face filled with anxiety. They needed answers. They needed to understand why Max had done what he did, why he had gone back into the fire, why he had risked his life for them. And the more they thought about it, the more they realized there were clues hidden in plain sight. The way Max had acted in the months leading up to the fire, the way he had always seemed to be on high alert, the strange way he reacted to certain people or situations. Max had always been a good dog, but now it was clear he had been something much more. Days passed, and the investigation continued. Sarah and John received occasional updates from Officer Martinez, but the answers they were looking for seemed just out of reach. But then, something unexpected happened. One evening, as Sarah was sifting through the few things they had managed to salvage from the fire, something caught her eye. It was a small notebook, hidden deep within the folds of one of the boxes. The notebook was worn and old, the pages yellowed with age. It looked like it had been Max's, and she could feel her heart racing as she opened it, hoping for some clue, some insight into Max's life. The pages were filled with strange symbols, and at first they made no sense. But as Sarah flipped through the pages, she started to see a pattern. The symbols seemed familiar, almost like a code. A series of numbers and letters appeared, written in a way that seemed deliberate, like a secret message. Max had been carrying something hidden within him, something he had been trying to communicate all along. Her hands shook as she read the final entry. It wasn't written in the same coded symbols, but it was in Max's familiar, simple handwriting. The fire was meant to cover up the real target. They think I'll fail, but I know what they're planning. I won't let them harm the family. The rest is up to you. Trust no one. The collar is your key to everything. Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she realized what Max had been trying to tell them. The fire hadn't been random. Max had known. He had been trying to stop something much bigger, something that could have destroyed their lives forever. The criminal organization, the syndicate, whatever it was, had targeted them, and Max had known it all along. As she processed the information, John walked into the room, his expression dark. "What is it?" he asked, his voice tense. Sarah held up the notebook, her voice barely above a whisper. "Max, he wasn't just protecting us from the fire. He was trying to stop something far worse." John's face grew pale as he looked at the notebook, then back at Sarah. "We need to find out who's behind this. We need to stop them before they do it to someone else." The next few days were a blur of frantic activity. The family was no longer just recovering from the loss of their home. They were now part of something much bigger. They had to protect themselves, and they had to find out who was behind the fire and why Max had been involved in it. They started to trace the clues. The collar, the notebook, the cryptic symbols. It all pointed to one thing. Max had been part of a larger operation, and now the family was in danger. The fear was palpable, but so was the determination. Max had given his life to save them, and now they owed it to him to uncover the truth. They reached out to the police, but Officer Martinez seemed to be the only one who truly believed in Max's role in the events. The rest of the authorities were skeptical, but the family wasn't going to let that stop them. Then came the breakthrough. The collar wasn't just a dog tag, it had a hidden transmitter embedded in it. When they had it analyzed, they discovered that the transmitter had been used to track their movements over the past year. Someone had been watching them. Max had been their protector, the one who kept them safe without them even knowing it. But now the real question was, who had been watching them, and why? The tension in the air grew heavier as the family began to realize the gravity of what they were facing. It wasn't just a case of arson, it was a calculated, well-planned operation, one that had been going on for much longer than they had ever known. The family was in the middle of a conspiracy, and Max had been their only line of defense. Now it was up to them to finish what he had started. The more they investigated, the more they uncovered. Each clue seemed to lead to a new layer of mystery. The fire was just the tip of the iceberg. The true enemy was still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike again. And as they pieced everything together, they began to understand the gravity of the situation. The clock was ticking, and they had to act fast. The family had been thrust into a dangerous game, and they were determined to find out who was behind it before it was too late. But even as they closed in on the truth, they couldn't shake the feeling that Max was still watching over them, guiding them from beyond the grave. And they knew deep down that they had to be ready for whatever came next. As the investigation reached its peak, the family's home, what remained of it, was now an eerie reminder of the past. Every room was still filled with the echoes of their lost memories, but there was no time to mourn. The mystery of Max's involvement had overtaken everything else. John and Sarah knew they couldn't rest until they uncovered the full truth, even if it meant going down a dangerous path. Max had given his life for them, and now they owed it to him to make sure his sacrifice was not in vain. The notebook had been a crucial discovery, but there was more to learn from it, more pieces of a puzzle that were still scattered in the dark. Sarah had spent sleepless nights poring over the notebook, decoding the symbols and cross-referencing the names that appeared there. It was like piecing together a fragmented map, one that would lead them straight into the heart of a criminal network. The entries in Max's notebook weren't just warnings. They were clues, each more cryptic than the last. One entry, in particular, caught Sarah's eye. "The man you trust the most is the one who's working against you." It was a simple statement, but one that sent a chill down her spine. Could it be that someone close to them had been involved all along? Could the betrayal have come from within? Sarah felt a heavy knot form in her stomach as she called John into the room to show him the latest clue. He stood by her side, eyes glued to the page, his face pale. This, this changes everything, he muttered under his breath. They spent the next few hours thinking through their circle of friends and acquaintances, retracing every person who had come into their lives in recent years. They couldn't trust anyone anymore. The thought that the very people they had trusted might be working for the syndicate was enough to shake their world to its core. But then something unexpected happened. Officer Martinez called with urgent news. "You need to meet me," he said, his voice graver than usual. "We found the location where this all started, the place where Max was originally trained. You're going to want to see this." John and Sarah felt their hearts race as they exchanged a look, both of them knowing this was the moment they'd been waiting for. The pieces were finally starting to fall into place. The location Officer Martinez had uncovered was an old abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was a place they had never thought twice about, but now as they approached the building, it seemed to pulse with the weight of everything they had uncovered. The warehouse was large, dark, and eerily quiet. The only sounds were the distant hum of city traffic and the rustle of leaves in the wind. As they stepped inside, they were met with an overwhelming sense of foreboding. The walls, covered in dust and grime, seemed to whisper secrets. It was as though the building had been waiting for them. Officer Martinez led them through the dimly lit corridors, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. They entered a room at the far end of the building, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. There, in the center of the room, was a large cage. The cage was empty, but the smell of old metal and something metallic filled the air. On the floor, there were remnants of shredded paper, like old training manuals, and a collection of collars identical to Max's. This was the place where Max had been trained, the place where the syndicate had turned innocent animals into something else. But something was wrong. "These collars," Sarah whispered, kneeling to examine them. "They all have the same kind of transmitter as Max's." Officer Martinez nodded solemnly. This was one of their training grounds. They didn't just use dogs like Max. They used a whole network of animals. They were weaponized for one purpose: to infiltrate and take down targets. Max was one of their best, but he had a conscience. That's why he broke away. The realization hit like a ton of bricks. Max hadn't just been trying to protect them from a fire. He had been trying to prevent the syndicate from using them as pawns. The fire? It was part of a bigger plan to eliminate anyone who stood in the way of the syndicate's operations. "Is there anything left?" John asked, his voice hoarse. "Anything that can tell us who's behind all of this?" Officer Martinez took a deep breath, shining his flashlight over the room. "Look closely. There's something more." As they examined the walls, they discovered several hidden compartments. One of them was unlocked, and inside they found a stack of folders. The folders contained detailed reports about different families, profiles, personal histories, and one name repeated throughout: Victor Chase. "Victor Chase," Sarah said, tasting the name on her tongue. "He's the one behind all of this." Martinez nodded grimly. "I think we found the mastermind, but we still don't know how far this goes. We need to find him before he does anything else." The truth was slowly unraveling, but time was not on their side. Sarah, John, and Officer Martinez knew that they couldn't let Victor Chase remain in the shadows any longer. They had uncovered too much, and now it was a race to stop him before it was too late. But even as they made their plans, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every shadow seemed like a threat. Every movement felt like someone was lurking just out of sight. The stakes were higher than they had ever been, and the family was now tangled in a web far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. Victor Chase had built his empire on fear and manipulation, using animals to do his bidding, but Max had defied him. Max had been the key to unraveling the whole thing. And now, with the clock ticking, Sarah and John had no choice but to go after Victor before he could do any more damage. But Max's final warning echoed in Sarah's mind: trust no one. And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, she realized the full weight of that warning. It wasn't just about the criminals outside. It was about the people closest to them, the ones they thought they could trust. In a world where everyone had a hidden agenda, how could they be sure of anything? With the revelation of Victor Chase's name, the pressure to act mounted. The more they uncovered about him, the more Sarah and John realized the true extent of his power. He was no mere criminal. He was a strategist, a manipulator who had built an empire on the backs of those who had no idea they were being used. His network ran deep, and it wasn't just animals he was exploiting, it was entire families, entire communities. People like Max, who were unknowingly recruited, trained, and turned into tools for a cause they couldn't possibly understand. Victor Chase had made sure no one could ever truly escape. Back in the safety of their temporary hideout, Sarah began to feel the weight of it all. The walls seemed to close in around her, suffocating her with the thoughts of what they had to do. She had never been in a situation like this before, and neither had John. Their lives had always been about simple, everyday struggles, bills, family, work. Now it was about stopping a man whose ambitions stretched farther than they could comprehend. The stakes had grown beyond personal safety. It was about protecting everyone from what Victor's empire could do if left unchecked. The information they had gathered so far was just the tip of the iceberg. They needed more, much more. Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities. Where could they find him? And how could they possibly take down someone as well-connected as Victor Chase? Then a thought hit her. The profiles in the hidden compartments, each folder detailed the lives of innocent families, their weaknesses, and their ties to Victor's operations. If Victor was smart enough to know everything about them, then maybe they could do the same. Maybe there were others who had escaped, just like Max. "John," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly but filled with determination. "We need to find those families. They may have answers we don't have yet, and they might even have a way of getting close to Victor without being noticed." John nodded in agreement, his face stern. "I'll start contacting the others. We don't know who we can trust anymore, but we've got to make sure they're still safe. We have no idea how far Victor's reach extends." It was a plan born out of desperation, but Sarah felt a strange sense of resolve. They were finally taking the fight to Victor, and with every new piece of information, they were slowly starting to see the bigger picture. The next morning, Sarah and John left the hideout, determined to track down those families. It was clear that they had a limited window of time before Victor made his move, and every minute counted. Meanwhile, Victor Chase had no idea that his empire was beginning to crumble. He was deep in his own machinations, preparing for the next phase of his plan. He had orchestrated everything carefully, from the animals to the families, to the shadowy deals he made with the city's underworld. For him, the game was always about control. It was about bending everyone to his will and making sure no one was ever in a position to challenge him. But now something was different. Sarah and John's relentless search for the truth had put his entire operation in jeopardy. Victor had always thought of himself as untouchable, his wealth and influence giving him the upper hand. But with the discovery of the warehouse and the growing network of people who had crossed paths with Max, his foundation was starting to crack. "I know they're getting closer," Victor muttered to himself as he paced in his office. The walls were lined with expensive art, and the hum of a high-end security system gave the space an air of invincibility. But despite the opulence, there was a feeling of tension in the air. It's just a matter of time before they find out everything. He pulled out a folder from his desk drawer, flipping it open to reveal a picture of Sarah and John. They had already crossed the point of no return. The couple was now fully in the crosshairs, and he had no intentions of letting them expose his empire. Back in the field, Sarah and John were making their way to the first family's home. They had managed to trace a contact who had once been associated with Victor's organization. This contact had information that could prove invaluable, if they could find them before Victor's men did. The family lived in a modest house in a quiet neighborhood, one that seemed untouched by the chaos swirling around them. But Sarah knew better. The house was a facade, a shield that masked the reality of the family's involvement with Victor. They knocked on the door, and a woman in her late 40s answered. She looked tired but warm, as though life had taken its toll, but she had learned to cope with it. "Can we help you?" the woman asked, eyeing them cautiously but not with suspicion. Sarah introduced herself, offering a small, comforting smile. "We're looking for information about Victor Chase. We know he's hurt a lot of people, and we believe you're one of the families who was affected. We need your help." The woman's face changed almost immediately. the warmth fading and replaced with a guarded expression. She looked over her shoulder before stepping outside, shutting the door behind her. "I don't know how you found me," the woman whispered. "But you're right. He hurt us all, but getting involved with him, it was a mistake. A big one. I lost my son to him." Her voice cracked as she spoke, and Sarah could feel the pain in her words. "What happened?" Sarah asked gently. The woman hesitated before responding. "Victor made us do things I'm not proud of. My son, he was supposed to be a part of it, but he tried to run. And now he's gone." The weight of her words hung in the air. It was clear that the syndicate's reach extended far beyond what they had imagined. Families had been torn apart by Victor's manipulation, and many had suffered in silence. But Sarah knew they couldn't give up. This woman, despite her pain, had just given them the lead they desperately needed. "Where is your son now?" John asked, his voice steady but filled with concern. "I don't know," she said, her eyes welling up. "But there's a place, a safe house, where some of the others went after they broke away from Victor. I can give you the address, but please, you need to be careful. He's watching." The address the woman provided was located on the outskirts of the city. It was a nondescript building, nestled in an industrial area, far away from the prying eyes of the public. Sarah and John knew this was it, the place where they would finally find answers. But as they neared the safe house, they couldn't shake the feeling that Victor had already anticipated their move. They were being watched, and the walls of secrecy were closing in around them. What would they find when they stepped inside? And would they be able to confront the man who had caused so much pain without falling into his trap? The answer to these questions lay just ahead, and as they walked toward the building, they knew this was the moment that would either make or break everything. Max sighed, his eyes finally meeting hers. He knew she was right. They couldn't give up now. They couldn't allow someone like Victor to continue wreaking havoc on innocent lives. "You're right," he said softly. "But if you want to take him down, you'll need more than just information. You'll need proof. Real, solid evidence that can't be ignored." He reached for a drawer in the desk, pulling out a thick folder. "This is everything I managed to gather before I left. It's not much, but it's enough to expose him. If you can get this into the right hands, it could bring his entire empire crashing down." Sarah took the folder from him, her pulse quickening as she opened it. The pages inside were filled with photos, documents, and details about Victor's illegal operations. It was the key to ending his reign of terror. "We'll make sure this gets to the right people," John said, his voice firm. "Thank you, Max. You've done your part." Max nodded, his expression resigned. "Just promise me one thing. Don't become like him. Don't let the fight consume you. He's a monster, but you're not. Don't lose yourselves in this." Sarah and John exchanged a look before nodding. They understood. They couldn't let Victor turn them into something they weren't. With the folder in hand, they made their way back out of the safe house, ready to face whatever lay ahead. They knew it wouldn't be easy. Victor would stop at nothing to protect himself. And now that he knew they were coming for him, there was no telling what he might do next. But they had no choice. They had to finish what they had started. As they left the building, the sounds of the city filled their ears. The calm before the storm had ended, and the battle was about to begin. It wasn't just about exposing Victor anymore. It was about saving the people he had hurt and making sure no one else ever fell victim to his cruelty again. In the distance, the silhouette of Victor Chase loomed large, but Sarah and John were ready. They had the truth on their side, and that was all they needed. And with that, the fight for justice began.